Company of Makers, Podcast Talks Workshops.
This podcast is dedicated to those who served during the Battle of the Atlantic throughout World War II. Hello and welcome to Land, Sea and Air. I'm Steve Bomford, co-founder of Company of Makers.
And I'm Mike Davis-Marks, a former Royal Navy submarine captain.
And in this episode, in fact this season, we've got 4 episodes where we're discussing the Battle of the Atlantic. And we've had the pleasure and the privilege to talk to some amazing people, Mike.
Yeah, they must be amazing because by definition, with the Battle of the Atlantic being 80 years ago, they're going to be in their mid to late 90s, if not centenarians. So that's they're extraordinary people to, still be telling their tale this long.
And I can say one thing's for sure, they are very good at spinning dits.
Steve, I'm really excited about this series. As many people are aware, or may not, it's the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Atlantic, and there was a big ceremony and events unveiling a memorial stone in Liverpool earlier this year. But a lot of people don't really know much about the Battle of the Atlantic, and I think, and I'm hoping that this 4-part podcast series will help sort of clarify some things. For one thing, it was the longest running campaign through World War II, and it is the one thing that Churchill said that kept him awake at night. He realised that if we lost the Battle of the Atlantic, lost the supply of goods, food, people, men, equipment across that vital ocean, then that might be the reason that Britain had to surrender. So it's a pretty important campaign, but not many people have heard much about it.
I quite agree. And I would say you're right, there's the insights that our guests have given us, or people will hear, have been quite remarkable. So our first guest is John Roberts, Rear Admiral John Roberts. And at the time I had a chat with him, he was a sprightly 99 years old.
John Roberts joined the Navy in 1938 and retired in 1978, 1 year after I joined in 77. So I didn't know him in service, but I knew of him. And he's a pretty remarkable character. So I'm looking forward to this interview.
Yes, he is a remarkable character. So let's have a listen to see what he had to say. John, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Right, Steve. Well, you want to know about the Battle of the Atlantic. When the Battle of the Atlantic started, I was still at Dartmouth as a cadet, and I didn't go to sea until 1941. But by then, things had been happening, including the Hood being sunk by the Bismarck. But I did go to sea in 1941 in a battle cruiser called Renown. And although we didn't take part directly in the Atlantic, we were based on Iceland, and we were in Iceland because we could then cover the gap between Greenland and Iceland, which is where the Bismarck came through, or they might try and come through the gap between Scotland, or Scapa Flow, and Iceland. And where we were in Iceland, we could cover either of them and try and intercept them. So indirectly, we were part of the Battle of the Atlantic, and also indirectly, we were part of the Russian convoys, because we could go up to North Norway and intercept the Russians there. But at the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, 1939 to 1941, the Germans were winning hands down as far as U-boats and so on. And we were having terrible losses, and it got to the stage, really, where Winston Churchill was worried we might almost have to surrender. But the reason, I suppose, was we didn't have enough escorts to escort the convoys properly. A convoy was going along with just 3 or 4 escort ships with it, and that's not nearly enough for a big convoy. Then we hadn't developed the proper tactics, which we did later, and were not able to deal with the U-boats that way. We had very little air cover because there were no long-range aircraft based on land that could reach the convoys. So there was a terrific gap of about 1,500 miles in the middle of the Atlantic where the U-boats would not be detected by aircraft. But the other part of the Battle of the Atlantic at that time was the German surface ships. And you remember that we caught one of them, the Graf Spee, and it was called the Battle of the River Plate, where 3 of our cruisers managed to intercept the Graf Spee, and she finally sank herself in the end. But there were several other similar German warships that were intercepting convoys, and of course a big ship can do a lot of damage. And the worry we had was that the Tirpitz could be the next one to try and come out. The Tirpitz was equal to the Bismarck, but even better, a newer one. However, by 1941, things had got better from our point of view. We got a lot more escorts. You remember Churchill managed to persuade Roosevelt in the United States to give us 50 old wartime escort ships. They weren't very good ones, but at least it was something. And it helped a lot, especially on the East Coast. Then later on, we began to overtake the Germans, really, on technology. The U-boats had to surface about every 24 or a little bit more hours because the air in the submarine was getting stale, and the batteries needed recharging using the diesel engines in the submarine. But a diesel engine exhausts, and it had to exhaust outside. They couldn't exhaust into the submarine itself, or they'd kill everybody. So they had to come to the surface. And they were able to do that in the first 2 years without worrying. But we then developed what was called 10 centimeter radar, which was fitted with escort ships, and that could pick up a submarine on the surface almost 10 miles away, and it could pick up a periscope on the surface probably about 1,000 or 2,000 yards away. This was a big improvement. Then the other thing we installed was called HFDF, which stood for HF slant DF, high frequency direction finding. The German wolf packs, when they discovered a convoy, whoever discovered it first would immediately signal all the other U-boats that were in the Atlantic so that they'd all congregate and get in front of the convoy when it passed them. Well, they sent their signals to each other. Well, our high-frequency DF, that picked up these signals that they were sending. And in a second, having got a bearing where that signal was sent from, an escort ship could roar down at full speed, and with luck, it would catch a U-boat. If not on the surface, it would pick it up on sonar. And the Germans weren't aware that they were giving themselves away in this way. So that was the radar and the direction finding, which was a great help to us. Then, by good luck, in I think it was 1941, we captured a U-boat, and although it tried to scuttle itself, it didn't go down. And a crew from the destroyer that had sunk it, or brought it to the surface, went over there, and they managed to collect all the communication equipment, which was known as Enigma. It was like a typewriter that the Germans typed their messages on, and then the technology behind it converted it into whatever it was, and we couldn't get it. But after we picked up an Enigma, we were then able to decipher a lot of the German signals. What we weren't aware of, or I wasn't really aware of, we'd all thought how clever we were getting Enigma and picking up their signals. The Germans, in fact, were picking up a lot of our signals too, and they were learning from our signals where the convoys were going. So it wasn't all on our side. Then the next improvement we had, when the Americans came into the war, they had long-range aircraft based on shore that could get almost right across the Atlantic. They even used flying fortresses. Some of the ones that went in Europe bombing, they used them for patrolling the sea around a convoy. And of course, they could detect. And if we got this direction finding, we would tell them where there was a U-boat. And that helped a lot. But it didn't cover about 800 miles right in the middle. And the Germans knew this, so they concentrated on this bit where there'd be no long-range aircraft. One of the ideas we had, it was called a Mac ship. It was a merchant ship, but on the bow, it had a catapult fitted with a Hurricane fighter. And when the Germans had their reconnaissance aircraft, I think they were Focke-Wulf, they were four-engined maritime reconnaissance aircraft. They were circling the convoys all the time, sending information about where they were and what course they were steering. Well, the Hurricane was fired off, and then it could attack the reconnaissance plane. So that was a help as well. But they were very brave pilots because they couldn't land on again. All they could do was to come back to where the convoy was and bail out or ditch close to one of the merchant ships.
That sounds like quite a dangerous thing to be doing.
It was, yes. The next development was escort carriers. They were merchant ships that the Americans were building almost one a day. And instead of completing it as a merchant, just fitted a flat top to it and a little island to it where aircraft could be controlled. And they could accompany the convoy the whole way. And they were equipped with swordfish, which were wonderful aircraft for everything really, but particularly for attacking submarines, because the engine is a very quiet one, and a swordfish can just be patrolling around at about 2,000 feet in and out of cloud, and it can come across a U-boat on the surface, and in no time at all, it'll dive down, fire 4 or 8 rockets, and the submarine will be sunk. So the swordfish were very good. And then they also had on the escort ships, they had martlets. The martlet was a small American naval fighter, and they could operate from the escort ships, and they would go out and attack any of the German reconnaissance aircraft. So we were getting better all the time. We then fitted a thing on the bow. Up until then, the only way ships attacked a submarine was with depth charges, which it dropped from its stern. And the sonar was unable to pick up the submarine for the last 300 yards that the destroyer was approaching where the U-boat was. And the U-boat captains knew this, and so at the last minute they would alter course violently. And when the depth charges were dropped, the submarine had got outside the pattern. And one idea that one of the leading anti-submarine people had, one ship would be in contact with the submarine, and it would stay about 1,000 or 2,000 yards away, and with its radar, it would guide another ship over the spot where the submarine was. And then the second ship would drop its depth charges, and they'd probably be far more accurate.
Mm.
But the other thing I was telling you about was called Hedgehog.
Yeah.
And Hedgehog was fitted on the bow of an escort ship, whether it was a corvette or a destroyer. And it fired, I think it was 30 small missiles about 1,000 yards ahead. So before the destroyer had lost contact with the submarine because it was too low, they fired the Hedgehog, and the Hedgehog formed a round pattern. And as they went down, if they hit a submarine, they exploded. The only trouble was that whereas a depth charge went off regardless, the Hedgehog missiles only went off if they actually hit a submarine. However, if it went off, you knew that you had actually hit it. And that was a very successful device. Well, by this time, by 1942 and 3, some of our destroyer captains were becoming fairly clever at hunting U-boats. And there was one particular man called Captain Walker. No doubt he was known as Johnny Walker. By coincidence, his son was at Dartmouth with me. But anyway, Johnny Walker became so clever that his ship, I think it sank 25 U-boats.
Crikey.
And he formed up with a group of about 5 other ships, and they practiced together. And they were known as an escort group. And they wouldn't be part of the escort of the convoy. They would be nearby, and as soon as U-boats were discovered, they would go, because they were much better at sinking it than the ordinary convoy escorts. And another man who was very good was Commander Peter Gretton. He was an escort commander rather than having an escort group. And he commanded the escort on a convoy in 41, and they had worked out how to deal with a U-boat attack. And in fact, on the one particular convoy I'm talking about, I think there were about 25 U-boats were lying in waiting for it. But Captain Gretton's method of using the escorts was so successful that although about 15 merchant ships were sunk, 7 U-boats were sunk. And that was a terrific shock for them, because that sort of thing hadn't happened before. And it made Admiral Dönitz, the German admiral, it made him think again. All this time, the German losses at the end of the war, they had lost over 700 U-boats. And you think of how many that was.
Yeah, that's a lot of people as well, isn't it?
We'd sunk a lot more. We'd lost, rather, a lot more merchant ships. But 700 U-boats and all sunk to the bottom of the ocean is not good.
No.
And that included 28,000 German sailors were lost. And more Germans were lost in U-boats than in any other part of the war, in the Luftwaffe or in the German army. The U-boats lost more people than the others.
Gosh, so it really was a war of technology and tactics, wasn't it? You don't really appreciate, well, I certainly didn't really appreciate just how important, the evolving technology and tactics was.
That's right. And towards the end, the last year or so, most of the experienced U-boat captains had been dealt with. And so the new submarines coming out had far less experienced crews. And that meant that they were easier to sink.
What was your personal story? Because that's a really good overview of the battle itself. But what experiences did you have during the Battle of the Atlantic?
Well, I'm saving the best till last.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Well, while I was in the Renown, I told you we were based in Iceland a lot, but on 2 occasions we went to the Mediterranean. The first time, it was nothing to do with the Atlantic exactly, but it was to help Malta. Malta was being besieged, really, by the Germans and Italians who were in Sicily, only 60 miles from Malta. And Malta was getting hammered every day. But we used aircraft carriers to ferry Spitfires and Hurricanes. And in the Triumph, we went down to Malta and we escorted an American carrier called the Wasp. And the Wasp had 47 Spitfires on the flight deck. And we steamed halfway to Malta and then turned into wind, and 47 Spitfires took off for Malta. And they got there.
Wow.
And the Wasp then went back to England, and 3 weeks later it reappeared with another 47 Spitfires. And so we did the same again. So that was nearly 100 Spitfires reinforcing Malta. And in fact, that had gone on for really until Malta was relieved. But for 3 years, aircraft carriers were used to escort Spitfires and Hurricanes. And altogether, about 750 of each type were flown to Malta that way. I think if we hadn't been able to do that, Malta would have been lost. And then North Africa would have been lost as well.
Yeah.
Rommel. So that was my exciting things in the Renown. But later on, I was transferred to a destroyer that was built. This was at the end of 1943. And I had been invited to say how I would like to specialize, whether I'd like to be a gunnery officer, a navigator, a torpedo officer, or what. And I really wanted to be an aviator, because my father had been in the Air Force. But they weren't taking regular officers as pilots. A regular officer had learned to fire a gun or drop a torpedo or something. We were left to do that. And all the aircrew for the Fleet Air Arm were wartime only. And we were led to believe that if we put down Fleet Air Arm, which they couldn't give us, we would be press ganged into a submarine. And that was the last thing I wanted.
Yeah.
So I put down on my bit of paper, anti-submarine. And in 1943, I became an amateur anti-submarine weapons officer. And in the destroyer I was in, the Serapis, I was in charge of the sonar. And of course, that made me even more interested in what was going on in the Battle of the Atlantic. But in the Serapis, we were based in Scapa Flow, but our job mostly, apart from 3 weeks off when we did D-Day in the Channel, most of the time we were doing Russian convoys. And a Russian convoy was not all that dissimilar to an Atlantic convoy. The only difference is I felt, and I wrote about it, when they were going to give a medal for Russian convoy people. If you were sunk in the Atlantic, the water wasn't all that cold. And if you were not well and picked up, you could go to a hospital in America or back in England again. But if you were on a Russian convoy and your ship was sunk and you were picked up in Murmansk, which was only about 80 miles from where the Germans were, the hospital in Murmansk had been destroyed completely. And the hospital that they had was the takeover of a school. And the operating pads were school desks. And I know of one case where a merchant Navy man was picked up after 3 days in an open lifeboat. And when he got to the school, they said, you have water in your lungs or in your tummy. We have to get rid of it. So they poured lukewarm water to melt the ice in his stomach. Well, when that had been done, he said, "Can I go now?" And they said, "No, you can't. You've got, I've forgotten the name of it now, in your legs when they get very cold."
Frostbite.
No, well, it's like frostbite. But anyway, it has to be dealt with. They said, "We're going to have to amputate both your legs." And so they put him down on one of these benches. They strapped him down. I think they probably gave him some vodka, but they had no stuff to knock people out. No anesthetic at all, and no proper weapons. So they used an ordinary saw, and they sawed both his legs off. And he woke up about 3 days later to look down and see that he had no legs. But he survived. He did live. And as I said earlier, if you were on an Atlantic convoy and you went to a hospital in America or England, you were looked after much better. The weather was much colder on a Russian convoy. I thought the weather was much worse. And one of the troubles we had was that the spray would come over the ship, and wherever it hit the ship, it would freeze. And if you have a lot of top weight, like at the top of the mast, a lot of ice, it makes the ship unstable. And it can be to a situation where the ship will capsize. So we had to chip the ice off all the time. And of course, the guns would freeze up, and the depth charge throwers would freeze up. It was not easy operating in that way. On the first convoy I did, we were at the back end of the convoy, and we had a ship on either side about 1,500 yards away. And it was a very dark night with snowflakes, and the sea was rough. It was freezing cold. And suddenly there was a call from the ship on our starboard side saying I'd been torpedoed. And it was a tribal class destroyer called Maratha. Well, they survived for about another 2 hours or so while we were circling around trying to pick up the submarine. And they said, "We've been torpedoed again." And then the ship exploded. And out of a crew of about 230, only 16 were saved.
Crumbs.
So the North Russia was not a good place to be.
No.
And I think when I came back from one of the convoys, the fourth one I did, there was a message from the Admiralty saying the wartime-only aircrew want to go back to their jobs when the war's over, and we had 50 aircraft carriers by that time. We're not going to have any pilots to fly them. If any regular officers want to fly, we want their names. So I had my name sent off immediately, and within 24 hours I was on a train from Staffordshire going down to London. And I passed the medical, and they said, "Right, go and pack up your kit, you're off to Canada." So when the war did end, I was actually in Canada starting my flying training.
So when you look back at that time, what feelings do you have? What comes to mind? I mean, obviously you've told me about the actual experiences, but I just wonder how you feel about it looking back. I mean, you're talking about this like it was yesterday, as many veterans do.
Well, I had my 20th birthday in Murmansk. You know, we just arrived in Murmansk, and that was my 20th birthday. So I was in Morocco for my 19th birthday, and I was in, I think it was Iceland for my 18th. And as a young man, it was awful to say it. It was exciting. I was pleased really that I was in it and not still at school. it's an awful thing to say. Of course, one of the things that I hadn't mentioned, in those days, all destroyers and other escort vessels, the bridge did not have a roof. It was open. So when it was rough, sea spray was coming over and soaking you all the time. So by the time you completed your 4-hour watch and went down, your clothes were soaked. You didn't want to take them off because if your ship was torpedoed, you wanted to have your clothes on at least. So you tried to sleep in your clothes, and then you went up on the bridge again in your clothes which were still soaking. So it was a fairly unpleasant life.
Mm.
But I'm glad I was in it. I'm glad I survived. I was very lucky. I survived the war, and I survived the Fleet Air Arm.
What did you do after the war then? Was that it? Had you had enough of the Navy, or did you go on to other things? What did you do next?
No. I joined the Navy, as I say, in 1938, to be in it for a career.
Mm.
And when the war ended, one of the advantages of being a pilot was that if you don't fly about 25 hours every month, you become dangerous and you cost money to the Admiralty because you're damaging planes. But if you're a gunnery officer, you're only allowed to fire a gun once a year. And that was really rather dull, being a gunnery officer. So I was very pleased I was in the Fleet Air Arm because I was doing what I wanted to do, but for the rest of my time in the Navy. I mean, I last flew in a Hunter probably 10 days before I retired.
What did you do after? So you were in the Fleet Air Arm, but you went on to other things as well, didn't you?
Well, yes. When I came back from Canada, the training hadn't quite finished. So I did my training in England for about 10 months, I think. Mm-hmm. I got my wings, and then I went to a carrier, the Triumph, in the Mediterranean. And there were two carriers in the Med then, Triumph and Ocean, both the same type, light fleet carriers. And the main excitement we had was it was when Israel was being created in 1948,
mm-hmm.
and in the last few months or weeks before the date, each side was trying to grab a bit more land than the United Nations had specified. And on one occasion, we were actually in Haifa Harbor, anchored, and a message came through to say that 3 Army tanks had been stolen by the Israeli terrorists, and the Army couldn't find them. Could we help? So I was actually catapulted off in Haifa Harbor with 3 others, because I was a flight leader by then. And we flew all over, it was still Palestine then. We flew everywhere but couldn't find anything. And I remember one occasion, we were by the Dead Sea, and we flew down the Dead Sea about 10 or 15 feet above the level of the Dead Sea, and looking at my altimeter, it was minus 20. No, minus 50. I was 50 feet below sea level, because that's where the Dead Sea is.
Yeah.
And then I went to Turkey one summer, had 4 days flying around Turkey, which was very interesting. One thing surprised me, when Triumph went into dry dock for about a month, the squadrons were sent ashore to Libya. And my squadron was sent to an airfield. It was called Castel Benito. Benito was Mussolini's name.
Yeah.
And, of course, Italy looked after Libya before the war. And I was surprised to find that there were probably about 50 German soldiers there.
Wow.
Working on the grounds. And they must have been Africa Corps people who were captured in 1943, and they still hadn't gone home in 1948.
Wow.
I felt sorry for them.
Mm.
Anyway, after that, I did, I was in the Triumph, and then I was lent to the Australian Navy. When the Korean War broke out, the Commonwealth, that's Canada, Australia, and us, all provided an aircraft carrier to be with the American carrier. And when it became the Australian turn a second time, they said, we can send to Sydney, but our aviators have all been once. So if any POMs haven't been yet, send them out. So I, with 13 others, went out to Australia. And I was there, in Australia for 6 months, working up, and then 6 months off Korea. And that was interesting.
So what was that like? How did that differ?
Well, the Australians were very similar. We had a wonderful captain in the Sydney. He was a brilliant ship handler. He never needed tugs. But he was also a dangerous man who came down to the wardroom at 5 to 11 before it shut and said, you and you, come up to my cabin. And he kept you there for about 2 hours drinking. And while you were feeling terrible next morning, he was as bright as a button. And when we left, he had to pay a courtesy call on the American Admiral at that base. And so he did that, and the American Admiral had to come back and pay a return courtesy call. Well, the Admiral was taken up to the captain's cabin, and he staggered down about 40 minutes later, just not falling down the steps. He got to the gangway and then fell the whole way down the gangway and landed on a canopy which was on top of the boat taking him home. The captain, having seen this, he trotted down the gangway to the boat and went with him. But when he got to the American ship, firemen lifted the American Admiral, carried him up the American gangway, gave a heave with his shoulder, and said, "You're Admiral," and then came back. We left a day or two after. We never heard any more about it.
You wouldn't want to get stuck in a drinking competition with him, would you?
No, certainly not. But the only other thing, I had a pilot's mate. We used to have a chap who looked after the engine and another one who looked after the airframe.
Mm-hmm.
It was decided that one man could do both, and he was known as a pilot's mate. So I had an Australian pilot's mate. And I said to him one day, I want to take you out, give you a meal ashore. And he said, "Oh, no, sir, I'll take you. I get paid more than you." That surprised me.
I bet it did. I can hear the shock in your voice still.
One of the other interesting things, when I went to Canada, we were trained by the Royal Canadian Air Force. I had an awfully nice Canadian warrant officer who taught me, and he was very good. But the Canadian base we were at, it was just south of Montreal, and which is in Quebec. And, lots of them are. Well, in fact, it was a place called Saint John, and they all called it Saint-Jean. And the local village, they all spoke French. Not our French, they spoke their French.
Mm.
And the group captain, who was in charge of the base, was a Frenchman. And he had joined the Canadian Air Force under some particular rules, which were that he never had to serve outside Canada. So about 25 of us arrived, all having come from warships, and here was this chap, the CO, who'd never been outside Canada.
Mm.
And one or two of the older ones that I was with, had got decorations. And we used to pull this fellow's leg. And being French, he used to get terribly excited and furious. But I'd never heard of, the Canadians were wonderful in the war.
Mm.
They landed on D-Day. They were terrific. But here was this Canadian Air Force man who only signed on providing he didn't have to leave Canada.
Maybe he was a lawyer before he joined up. He obviously knew something everybody else didn't.
Yes. I knew a lot about the Battle of the Atlantic, although I wasn't actually on real proper convoys. But at any time we could have. But the one thing we did do in the second destroyer I was in, the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary were bringing American soldiers across, preparing for D-Day. And they were bringing 15,000, I think, each time.
Mm.
Well, because they could do 30 knots and a convoy only went at about 10 knots, they were sent on their own. It was thought that at 30 knots, it would be most unlucky if a submarine was in their way. And a submarine would never catch them because underwater they can only do about 5 knots. So they were sent on their own. But for the last 300 miles, they were escorted by a destroyer. And that's what mine had to do. And I was a navigator at that time.
Mm.
So we had to steam out 300 miles from UK and rendezvous with a ship traveling at 30 miles an hour in the opposite direction. And if we hadn't been spot on, or if I hadn't been spot on, and my navigation wasn't too good, I used to go up to the crow's nest to see if I could see the ship coming.
The old-fashioned way.
Yes.
So when did you leave the Navy, John?
1978.
1970.
I joined in 38 and left in 78.
So what was your role? Because you left as a rear admiral. Am I right in thinking that?
That's right, yes. After I'd commanded the Ark Royal, and I think, did you say you'd read that book about when Ark Royal went to Belize?
No, but we did talk a little bit about it the other week, didn't we? Tell us that story.
Well, when we'd been into Plymouth for Christmas Eve, and when we came out, we always just transferred a lot of our fuel before coming in, so we were lighter. So as soon as we got out after Christmas, we were refueling from the tanker, and my yeoman came over and said, "I've got a signal here for you, sir." And it was from MOD. I have a feeling I forget who was in charge then. But anyway, he said, "Ark Royal is to proceed with all dispatch to Belize," which I think it's British Honduras.
Mm.
But Belize is the big town. And it was because Guatemala, which is on the other side of Belize, was going to invade British Honduras. And, you know, they had quite a big army. And we only had, I think there were 100 British guardsmen, was the only military force that we had there. And Guatemala had quite a big army and an air force. So we were told to proceed at maximum speed, or with all dispatch. And I'd only heard about all dispatch when Hornblower was told to do that. It was just at full speed or at economy speed normally. And anyway, we steamed at full speed for a day and a half. And by that time, 2 Buccaneers had been fitted with extra long-range tanks. And they took off, followed by 2 of our Phantoms.
Mm.
And they went together for about 800 miles. And then the Phantoms transferred, if they could, you know, do that, transfer fuel in the air. They transferred fuel to top up the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers then went on, and the Phantoms came back to Ark. And they got to Belize, and they spent about maximum 10 minutes eating the hell out of the place and waggling their wings to make quite certain that if there were any Guatemalans there, they knew that a British aircraft carrier was in the vicinity.
Mm.
And they'd be foolish if they invaded. Well, the Buccaneers then came back, and it was a brilliant bit of airmanship that 800 miles out from Ark, they met up with the 2 Phantoms again, because they didn't have enough fuel to get the whole way back. And they the Phantoms transferred fuel to the Buccaneers again, and all 4 of them came back and landed on. And the invasion never took place. There was an article in the Telegraph a day or two later, but it never got the recognition that I think it should have done.
Mm.
The Air Force had said, oh, we can get to Belize, but in fact they had to they had to fly to Canada and then down across America, and the Americans wouldn't let them. So the RAF couldn't get there. And if it hadn't been for an aircraft carrier, we would have lost Belize.
Mm.
And if Park Royal had still been there, we'd never have had the Falklands War either.
That's true. That is very true. Shows
anyway,
shows the
after
importance of naval air power, doesn't it?
Yes. After that, they made me a Rear Admiral, and I went to Portland.
Mm-hmm.
I often thought it was a bit of a joke, because while I was flying, I did the flying instructor's course. So I had after my name CFI or QFI, Qualified Flying Instructor.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to Portland to take charge of the seaman training. So I was the first qualified flying instructor to teach seamanship. Anyway, I had 18 months at Portland, which was wonderful. We trained all sorts of ships, NATO ships.
Mm.
We had Germans, Norwegians, Dutch. I had 3 Dutch officers on my staff. And all British ships all came through. Sometimes when they had a new crew, and sometimes when they had part new crew. But new weapons were coming out so often that quite often someone who hadn't been to sea for about 5 years, the equipment he was going to be using, he hadn't used before.
Mm.
Came to Portland to be taught how to use it. I had one interesting incident, which you can always cut out if you want. I went to the final inspection of a German ship, and the Germans took it terribly seriously. And one of the petty officers I had on my staff was a fluent German speaker, and he could also sing. So he came with me, and halfway through the inspection, they had to prove that if they were going to be at action stations for a long time, they could feed people at their action station.
Mm.
They had to prove that the galley could do that. So I went with the captain into his little cabin, and I was eating my sandwiches, and suddenly there was a click on the SRE, and a German voice started singing bawdy German songs. The German captain practically had a fit. He rushed out and started shouting orders and things, and my petty officer was in the SRE cabinet, where you broadcast to the ship from.
Mm-hmm.
And they got a gun, and they battered the door down to get in there. That was one of my little jokes that I played on them.
Was this your idea, or...?
It was my idea, yes.
I'm sensing there's a naughty sense of humour in there, John.
Yes. I did once. It was my idea again. Coming out of Portland Harbour, they had to do it dead on 8 o'clock, and I would arrive at 5 to 8 from my motorboat and get on board, and they would have had to have prepared everything so that 5 minutes after I got there, the ship began to move. And it would take 10 minutes to get out of the harbour. Anyway, about 5 minutes after they started to move, I'd organised for one of my staff, who'd got a suitable clothing on and a life belt, to jump over the side. And so the captain was manoeuvring to get out of the gap between the breakwater, and someone would shout, "Man overboard!" And that was the last thing he'd expected.
So is a qualification then for that role to be a very good practical joker?
Anyway, having done that, I moved to Northwood, which was the headquarters of the Fleet Admiral, who was an admiral called Lewin in those days. Admiral Lewin was was quite well famous. He was a rugger player and played rugby for the Navy. And I don't think many admirals did that.
Probably not.
Anyway, he was the CNC, and I was the chief of staff. And I was there for 2 years. And then they sent me to Yeovilton to be head of the Fleet Air Armoured Yeovilton. So I had three jobs, all nice jobs, as a Rear Admiral, which took up about 6 years. And then I retired. And I was only 54, 55. I was 55, I think, then.
So how old are you now, John?
I was 55 when I retired.
Yeah, but how old are you now?
99.
99. So what have you spent the last 45 years doing?
I should say playing jokes on people.
Well, if that's not the perfect ending to this, I don't know what is.
I was very lucky. First of all, I'd always rather despised, unfairly, people who were on the dole. I thought they were just too lazy to get a job. So I went on the dole as soon as I retired, and I was allowed to do that for 6 months. And then a chairman of a company who'd met me before offered me a job with a company called Aeronautical and General Instruments, and they made military cameras for reconnaissance.
Yep.
And I knew all about them. So he hired me to develop an export market for them. And I joined the company on a Thursday, and the boss said, I want you at Heathrow on Monday morning. We're going to fly around the world. And that's what we did, first class, all the way around the world, with India first. And I was born in India, and I'd been to India several times before in the Navy.
Mm.
So the military headquarters in Delhi is very similar to it is in Whitehall. You know, the senior officers are on the 5th floor.
Yeah.
And we got there, and we had an agent who worked for us who'd been chosen by the chairman. And these two argued for 3 days. When we left, we got on the plane to go on to, I think, Singapore. And the chairman said to me, I hated every minute of that. I'm never going to go to India again. India is all yours. And I thought, well, he's been so rude to our agent there, they'll never want us again. But in fact, they did. My chairman was very good at golf, and the agent, his son was a golfer. So it was arranged that the chairman would play golf with the agent's son one morning. So when I saw the chairman at lunchtime, I said, how'd it go? And he said, well, it's a lovely golf course. But he said it was a bit off-putting. Every time the agent's son made a bad shot, he kicked the caddy. I didn't think that one up. That happened. But two things. They had nothing to do with the Battle of the Atlantic. But he used to come over, the agent used to come over, and one day he blew his nose in the way they do with their fingers. And he said, John, I know you think we're awful blowing our nose that way. We can't understand why you take a rag out of your pocket, you blow your nose into it, and then you put it back into your pocket. And another time he said, I know you think we're corrupt in India because everybody's having a backhander, but it's because everybody gets paid hardly anything out there. I discovered that a vice admiral in the Indian Navy gets paid the same as a petty officer in our Navy. So it's not surprising that if the admiral can backhand and get some equipment and get some money from it, that's what they do. Anyway, this agent said to me, John, when you've been out for a bit longer, you'll discover that the most corrupt country in this world is yours, not mine. And when Robert Maxwell died, and was exposed, he sent me an email to say, you remember our conversation about corruption?
That's a good debt. That's a very good debt. And I really appreciate your time.
I hope we meet one day.
Yes, I'd love to meet. Well, if you're not far from Mike, that is eminently possible.
Okay, Steve. Bye.
Wow, Steve, that was a real tour de force by John. I mean, how articulate is he at the age of 99?
Yeah, and probably the best explanation I've had of the Battle of the Atlantic as well.
Yeah, I thought so too, actually. A real sort of, unwrapping a lot of some of the mysteries here. And also, this was very early on in his naval career. He said he was at Dartmouth, the new entry officer training establishment, when war broke out in 1939. But he was still very young. He was 17, because he said he spent his 18th birthday off the coast of Iceland, his 19th birthday in Morocco, and his 20th in Murmansk. That's a spread of geography there.
It sure is. I'm not sure I fancy the birthday in Murmansk, to be honest.
No, it would have been pretty cold, I think. But I thought there was some really, a really great overview of what the Battle of Atlantic was all about, and actually some of the terrific stuff, both good and bad, that went on. And he was very honest as well. He said, in 1941 when he went to sea, we, the Allies, were doing pretty badly. We had very few escorts, poor tactics, no air cover. There was a 1,500-mile gap in the middle, and we're suffering terrible losses. Yet, a year or two later, we got more escorts. We bought 50 off the Americans. We had better tactics, and we were understanding how to defeat them better. It was really good to show how the campaign evolved over that time. Yeah,
and I think also the importance of learning as a military organisation. I think that's something that's very apparent.
Well, they do say, actually, the greatest lesson of history is that we don't remember the lessons of history. Because we had convoys in World War I, and yet somehow we'd forgotten to employ those tactics that we learnt at great cost in World War I at the start of World War II. However, it would be said that we did learn, and there were some really interesting things that came out of that. He talked about, for instance, capturing an U-boat, and just for listeners, U-boat stands for Unterseeboten, so shortened to U-boat, where they managed to procure the first Enigma machine, which allowed us then to start decrypting some of the German messages.
So I love the word procure, like they bought it from a shop.
They borrowed it but didn't return it, I think is probably more accurate, yeah. And we mustn't forget the human sacrifice here. I mean, he talked about the Germans lost 700 submarines over the course of the war, and 28,000 German sailors. And he said, and I think this has been verified, that actually the Germans lost more sailors or submariners than any other component of their war machine, like the Luftwaffe or the Wehrmacht.
Am I right in thinking that actually their loss rate was even higher than Bomber Command? That they had the highest loss rate of any armed force?
That is what's claimed, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support that. So yes, and our own submariners didn't fare much better. I think our own submariners had terrible losses, and we lost boats and sailors out of proportion to the size of the force. So I think, and it was interesting, when he qualified, he volunteered to be a naval aviator. And wasn't allowed to because he was a regular officer. They wouldn't allow regular officers to be aviators in those days. So the one thing he knew he didn't want to be was a submariner. And I think I can relate to that. So he chose to become an anti-submariner or an anti-submarine warfare officer. And that's what he did throughout the rest of the war until peace came. When he then did volunteer to be an aviator and spent the rest of his career flying, or most of it.
I think we should be thankful that he made that decision, to be quite honest.
Yeah, well, I mean, he talks about all sorts of stunning feats that they did during that campaign. and the evolution of the tactics and the equipment to defeat the U-boat menace. And as I said at the very start, this campaign, which is largely out of sight, out of mind to most people, because it wasn't bombs dropping on cities and towns in Britain. It was happening, thousands of miles out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He said, this was the one thing that Churchill lay away at night worrying about, because if we'd lost the Battle of the Atlantic, we'd have lost the war. There's no question that we would have been starved to death.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting. I loved, some of the things he got up to. He talked about being on an aircraft carrier for the relief of Malta in the Mediterranean, where they were ferrying 47 Spitfires a time on two carriers across, so that the Spitfires could fly off when they got within range of Malta, and then were based in Malta to defend it. And had we lost Malta, then we might not have won North Africa, and we certainly couldn't have done the Sicily landings and then Italy, and so we might have lost the war as a result of that. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, of course, he talked about the Arctic convoys. And I know some of your other podcast guests have done the Arctic convoys. And the Arctic convoys were part of the Battle of the Atlantic, but they were much colder. And actually, one of the enemies wasn't actually U-boats, it was ice. And ice forming on the top of bridges and superstructures and aerials, and the ship becoming very top-heavy and therefore unstable and could capsize. So the Arctic convoys, which was providing relief and resources and supplies to Russia, who of course was an ally during those war years, was as important as the Atlantic crossings were to us.
Yeah, it's actually very difficult to comprehend how difficult that must have been. Not just, fighting U-boats and aircraft, but the weather. Quite remarkable.
I also loved, and I think you did too, judging by your responses, I loved his sense of humour. And he was a bit of a practical joker. And irrespective of how many stripes he had in his arm, he liked playing practical jokes. And that came out in a few examples. I thought they were really fun.
Do you know, I think what you've said there, irrespective of how many stripes he had on his arm, is really quite telling, because you wouldn't necessarily have known. I mean, he's such a down-to-earth kind of chap as well, given his experiences.
Yeah, he did great things. He rose to a pretty high rank in the Royal Navy, a Rear Admiral. He did 3 jobs as Rear Admiral towards the end of his time, and yet he maintained his humility and sense of looking after the people within his care right to the very end. And I think I didn't serve with him, but I imagine if I had, I would have enjoyed it hugely. Yeah,
well, he was obviously a good dit spinner, at the very least.
There is one of his stories he told, which has a personal for me, which is when he was in command of HMS Ark Royal. This is the old Ark Royal in the early 70s, 1972, and he was sent at all dispatched across to the Central America, where trouble was brewing in British Honduras or Belize, and with its neighbour Guatemala threatening to invade any day. And they raced across and got the Buccaneers, which were naval aircraft that could fly low strike missions, off. And the reason that resonated with me is because I have a friend who's a publisher who wrote that book, Ronan White, and the book's called Phoenix Squadron, and it's a fascinating tale about how navies can prevent wars from happening by just being at the right time in the right place. And so and I've been, giving talks about Phoenix Squadron. So the fact that he was the commanding officer of HMS Ark Royal at the time was really, really appropriate, apt. Loved that.
It was a good example of show of force and the impact that can have, isn't it?
Exactly. And sometimes you just need to have the presence of a fleet, or a fleet in being, as it's sometimes known, to stop things happening, rather than, it's the present Teddy Roosevelt's old adage of speak softly and carry a big stick. Well, HMS Ark Royal was the big stick with its Buccaneers and Phantoms. and a real example of naval power.
Exactly.
So he's 99 now. So we should find out when he becomes 100, shouldn't we?
We should. I think that. We'll ask you to do that, and obviously we will add a little bit of a birthday celebration to the end of this recording if he has passed that milestone.
I thought that was a really great interview. Well done on eliciting all that, but he was such a good responder, and it was so interesting to listen to. I think that probably gives everyone a really good overview of what the Battle Atlantic was all about.
Yes, I agree. And he's a very easy person to listen to. There were a lot of outtakes that were quite humorous as well. So he was very, very good value, I think.
Oh, do you think we could do an outtakes? It will be all right on the night sort of version of Land, Sea and Air.
Well, we could do, but I think it would just be featuring you and I with all the mistakes we made.
I don't think people have got the patience to listen to that long recording.
No, I don't think they should either. We shouldn't impose it upon them. Anyway, Mike, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Before you go, if you're a member of the Armed Forces community and need support with your mental health, Op Courage can help. Use the link in this podcast description for details. Or you can phone the Combat Stress Helpline on 0800 138 1619. If you'd like to contact us, email studio@companyofmakers.com.
Finally, we're giving a really big shout out to our funders, the Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity. Thank you.